Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Jonathan Ferro, along with Lisa Abramowitz and Anne-Marie Hordern. Join us each day for insight from the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. From our global headquarters in New York City, we are live on Bloomberg Television weekday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app.
Let's build on the conversation. He's 10 years younger, without a tie. Amos Hochstein, the former senior advisor for energy and investment. Amos, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Good to see you. You seem happy. We can get into that a little bit later. This came from Javier Blas just in the last week. I know you've read the piece. What Ukraine has is scorched earth. What it doesn't have is rare earth. Surprisingly, many people, not least US President Donald Trump, seem convinced the country has a rich mineral endowment. It's a folly. What's your view on all of this?
Well, first, I think Javier has done a lot of research into this. Rare earths, I've never seen any evidence of rare earths in Ukraine. There probably are critical minerals which are different from rare earths in Ukraine, but not at a stage where they've been identified and there's been any exploration drilling, not in any of the commercial quantities that we are aware of. There may be, and there are, I'm sure there's some data there behind some of this that suggests there is. But to get from a greenfield, from a discovery to a production can take many, many years. This is not expanding existing deposits. So I think this is a worthwhile conversation to have with Ukraine about how to develop their mineral resources. We should talk about how to redevelop their gas resources, how to develop their green power resources. Ukraine, I believe, can be a major supplier of power to Europe. Critical minerals, I think, is going to be, regardless of how this turns out, is going to be many years away.
When it comes to all these commodities, wasn't a discussion like this on the table when you were working in government under Biden?
This has been under discussion since I was working in government in the Obama administration. So this has been many, many years. We've always wanted to see Ukraine develop its resources because that will give them economic boost that will allow them to be more independent from Russia and to grow their economy. The corruption was the issue, right? But the resources were there. The issue is we shouldn't be taking the revenue from it. We should want them to have the revenue so that they can invest in the country, so that their Ukrainians across Europe that had to flee can come back and they can rebuild a country, a military, a security apparatus, and a future for their people.
You mentioned corruption, so I am reminded of an opinion piece you wrote in 2020 when you left the supervisory board of Naftogaz. So you've done a lot of work in Ukraine when it comes to this sector. Do you think the corruption has gotten better since then, tackling the corruption?
Not really. I think there's a lot of corruption. Predates Zelensky. It was a corrupt society before the Maidan revolution. The idea was, let's make it better. I think it did get better, and then some of those efforts stalled. There's been a tradition in government when there's a little bit of stress to go and use that moment to rob the kitty from state-owned enterprises. That's a problem that sort of ebbs and flows. I think it continues with the state control and during the war. It's hard to criticize during a war when you're having your cities bombed regularly, how you don't do that. So there's a lot of temptation there. But I think it's a systemic issue that the international community should tackle.
For just ignoring some of the more heated rhetoric around the Ukraine-Russia war, because of the lack of accountability of where funding is going, do you think that there is validity in pushing back on just how much the U.S. and even European nations are contributing to the Ukrainians in this Ukraine-Russia war?
Look, you guys separate a couple of things. One is we need to support Ukraine because another country invaded. You can argue whether or not the words that Zelensky used before the invasion were smart or not, was it good or bad. Nothing gives you the right to invade another country because you don't like what the leader said. You just can't do that. So they invaded another country and we should support it. And they invaded Georgia in 2008. And if we didn't intervene, they would have controlled all of Georgia today and Ukraine. So you got to stop that. Then I think 100%, and we talked about this already in the Biden administration, there's a lot of concern about where's this money going and who's in control of it. And this came up in many conversations with Zelensky, with his top people about our concerns. So what you should do is tighten the controls on the money and put the oversight in place so that you know where the money is going. But you can't do it while also saying, well, because of that, we're going to allow the Russians to take a whole bunch of territory and win the war. So it's a really tough balance, but, you know, government's hard.
When you left the government, where was the Ukrainian situation in terms of how much territory Russia had taken and the sense of the balance of power at a time where it seemed like Russia was making some inroads?
So Russia was making some inroads, but largely the conflict had been frozen for a long time, where Russia makes a little bit of inroads, then Ukraine makes some inroads somewhere else. You know, on a net basis, Russia was making more inroads than it was losing, but it wasn't massive amounts of territory, so it was largely frozen. But that was in order to get to a negotiation. I agree with the Trump administration that enough is enough. Let's get to a negotiation. I think you have to force both sides to come to the table, and you got to force some tough choices. By both sides need to make some tough choices. Freezing the war in place and saying, okay, we're done, let's call this a border, is really tough, because hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. To do what? Just to allow for the parts of the country to go away? And then what? Is there a disarmed Russia on the other side? I don't think so. So they invade again in 2 years, in 4 years. So you have to create a negotiation that has both sides at the table, that allows for some kind of resolution that both sides don't like, but that ends the war.
Some people have made the argument that the current president, President Trump, is attempting to shock the Europeans into action. Can you walk us through your experience with the European allies? How frustrating was that?
I think for us, for the United States, it's always a bit frustrating. I think we like to go a little bit faster, and we want to do things more aggressively when it comes to areas of conflict and negotiations. On the other hand, on the economic policy, we tend to go a little bit slower. On the environmental issues, we were, as a pro-green administration, were frustrated by how far sometimes the Europeans would go without thinking through the consequences of where they were going, and then they would suffer the consequences, which affects us, and they create high watermarks that we then have to deal with our constituencies of, why aren't you doing what the Europeans? And it's a bad answer. You say, well, wait 2 to 5 years, you'll see why we're not doing what the Europeans are doing. So I think there's always been frustrations there. We tried to do trade policy with Europe in the Obama administration, the Biden administration, the Trump administration. Now again, very frustrating, very difficult to do it. So it's built into the system. But at the end of the day, these are our allies. And we have to recognize that the argument with them is this is the argument inside the family versus the arguments with others, which is outside the family.
But don't you almost sometimes need to maybe shake them up? You were part of the Obama administration telling Germany not to go ahead with Nord Stream 2, yet they did it.
Yes, and if they didn't do it, large parts of why their declining economy is now would have been avoided. They bought into the argument of your heroin dealer. The first hit is free, and after that you pay a big price. And it's not only that. I went to Germany before the Ukraine war, 5 months before, and said, something's wrong, you're in trouble. And they insisted that they weren't, when the Russians were playing a game of filling their storage in the winter from their own storage instead of from Russia. I said, how is it possible your pipeline's empty, but your storage is filling?
What took the Europeans so long to see the intelligence that the Biden administration was seeing and that Jake Sullivan was openly telling the press from the podium?
We shared all the intelligence. I think sometimes they had the exact same intelligence we had on the invasion. We were saying the invasion's coming on this day, on this week, on this day, at this hour. They refused to see it. No, this is just an exercise. I think sometimes being the neighbor, you kind of can't see us being an ocean away. We see it with clearer eyes. We've missed plenty of intelligence. I don't want to, we had 9/11 that people were training inside the United States and we didn't see it. So I think they were just too close to the Russians and always making the excuses for him. And that was the problem with Merkel and others. They were making the excuses. No, he doesn't mean it. And I think we have to learn a lot of lessons, and Europe has to learn more lessons. But I think they have learned a lesson. They don't want this war to end this way because they're worried that this war, it doesn't end here, and 5 years from now he invades another country.
I wanted to finish on this because we could talk to you all day. I mentioned this a couple of times and I was half joking, but semi-serious, of course, 10 years younger, without the tie. I've said this a few times. There are some really, really smart, intelligent people that work inside our administrations here in the United States. We spoke to one last week, Secretary Besson of the Treasury. I worry more and more as years pass by that those kind of people want to go into US government. I consider you part of that. Dalip Singh, another, Wally Adeyemo, really talented, intelligent individuals. You might disagree with them on their politics, but when it comes to policy, they've thought things through. Do you worry about that too?
I think it's getting harder and harder to come into government. I mean, obviously the hours are terrible, the stress is high, your family time is terrible, and I've seen so much damage to people's families just by making the choice to, especially if you're at the White House or at senior levels in the government. And the problem is, if you're not already wealthy, it's becoming even harder because the income is relatively lower. And I get it, it's higher than the average American salary, but it is lower relative to what the earning potential is for the people that are in those jobs. And the stress on it and the amount that it costs you to manage your life, the government doesn't pay for, and the scrutiny. I mean, I have protesters outside my house yelling that I'm accusing me of genocide, going after my daughter and putting her on Instagram, my 13-year-old. That comes with the job. And it's not like the Secret Service was there to help me or the cops. I mean, they're just standing there watching. So what you get, the blowback that you get, and then to manage your life, is really, really difficult. The process for confirmation by the Senate is out of control, and for relatively low-level positions. So to come and be an assistant secretary in some random agency, you are now supposed to hire lawyers and accountants and to do a forensics auditing of your life, of your personal life, of your financial life. I mean, it's too much. And so I worry that outside of it being, you know, I made a lot of money, so I'm going to go into government and play with that for a little bit, and that happens in both parties, I worry that it gets harder and harder to get good people to come in.
I think a lot of people share that worry. Amos, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Hopefully we'll catch up again soon. Amos Hochstein there, the former senior advisor for energy and investment to President Biden. Ed Mills of Raymond James joins us now. We can extend this conversation. Ed, welcome to the programme, sir. Hopefully we can hear you, because we didn't hear our last guest. So hopefully we can hear you, so. Ed. Ed, there you are. Perfect. Wonderful. Ed, let's talk about the Doge effort over the weekend, sir. That email that went out. What do you think the consequence of all of this will ultimately be?
So, John, I want you to send me an email by midnight tonight, and if you don't respond, I get $1 million. I think that's one of the responses here in D.C. The question I have with this is that if you go into the executive order that establishes Doge, this is not within their charge. And so you are going to have a series of things, and this is a real issue here in D.C., as to who are you actually reporting to. And if you don't report, are there some legal consequences? Certainly everyone who wants to keep their job is looking for guidance of exactly what they are supposed to do with this under the executive order. Doge is supposed to be working on an upgrade to the IT system and support the chief of staff to the president, Susie Wiles. Doge does not set this out in executive order, but we keep on seeing expansion of that. And until we get some of the legal infrastructure around that, I think there's going to be a lot of quote-unquote trauma and uncertainty here in D.C. If you want to shrink the federal government, you can do that. We've seen that in the past. There are processes in place. Clearly, they want to move fast, as you saw Treasury Secretary Besson say with your interview. However, it is unclear on if you move fast, is it more effective or not?
Ed, we have several government agencies, people that Trump put in place, people that everyone in a lot of mainstream media were calling serious loyalists, telling their employees to leave those emails on read. At the same time that Trump is tweeting out memes, one of SpongeBob SquarePants saying, "This is what I got done last week." Quote, cried about Trump, cried about Elon. If you're an employee at one of these agencies and you want to secure your job, what do you do?
You listen to your manager, because ultimately that is going to be what you kind of have to work with. But there is a lot of uncertainty. And, I think that when we look at kind of some of the, we've discussed the national security issues, the, classified issues. It is very kind of appropriate to have the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, come out and say to the entire intelligence community, do not respond. There's just certain things that you can't. When you hear from Elon Musk through his posts, some of this is, are there government employees who are not on their email, are not responding to things? That's an appropriate thing to get a pulse check for individuals, whether or not they are engaged in their job. There have been individuals who've been told not to do their job. You look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There's been a number of folks told, stand down, don't work. So if you're in that position, how do you respond? But I'm also really looking, Anne-Marie, at what's going to also happen here in D.C. We have a lot of to-dos in Congress this week. We're going to see at the end of the week, are they going to be able to fill out that 5-step thing? Did they pass a budget? Are we moving forward with the tax credits? Are we moving forward with that new defense and immigration spending?
Do you think the House will pass the budget this week?
I'm really skeptical. I think that, we have a situation where one or two members can sink the entire thing. We already have one hard no out there. When we look at this bill, I don't know if there's enough of a crisis or a deadline to get this done just yet. So I wouldn't expect it to kind of go clean on the first start, but almost nothing happens clean on the first start. I am expecting that more attention is going to go to the Senate-passed budget. Maybe that provides a quick win for the president on immigration spending, on defense spending, if they need a backup plan, if the House just can't get everyone on the same page just yet.
How much spending that you see being cut from the U.S. government is real versus just sort of theorized about? In other words, how much oxygen have they really saved by making some of these cuts in the federal workforce and announcing cuts to the Defense Department that haven't been approved yet and are sort of discussions at this point?
Yeah, at least at this point, it's very low. A lot of the savings that have been announced are contracts that have actually already been paid. So I want to see more kind of on a go-forward basis how much that is going to kind of take into account. When we look at Congress, we're not quite sure when they are coming up with some of their budget cuts. How much are those paper savings? How much of those are real savings? I do think, though, there is a lot of momentum of making the tax cuts that passed in 2017 permanent. And I don't think they're going to be able to get $5 trillion worth of pay-fors either through DOGE savings or through some of the savings that Congress chooses. So having this conversation about how aggressive DOGE is being, how aggressive we are going to be on tariff policy is providing political cover and groundwork to actually add to the debt and the deficit over the next 10 years, even when you've had this narrative that there's such a significant reduction in staff and savings of the federal government, Lisa.
Ed, thank you, sir. We're going to leave it there. Ed Mills there of Raymond James joining us on the latest DOGE effort down in Washington, D.C. So here's the latest. UMich sentiment showing consumer inflation expectations jumping to their highest level in almost 3 decades. Survey responses, mostly along party lines, showing new inflationary concerns about President Trump's tariff policy. Joining us now to break it down, Nela Richardson of ADP. Nela, good morning.
Good morning.
Got to start with you, Mitch, on Friday. How reliable is that economic data? How much weight should we put on that?
I think it gives you good situational awareness. Should you create monetary policy around it? No, I don't think so. But in terms of where the consumer is going, what they're thinking, and tracking that every single month, I think it gives you a benchmark or at least some context for how consumers are feeling. We can't interview every person on the street. If we could, we get, more real-time data, but it's a survey. There's luckily other things from the Fed about consumer expectations from the New York Fed and other Fed banks that we can also use to support this data. But I think if we take from it that consumers are still feeling inflation and it's dampening their sentiment, I think that's a great piece of information to move forward to and think about the economy in a broader context.
We've been pretty bearish. I've gotten a couple of emails, people saying, really, this is coming back. And on the flip side, there's a lot of optimism among businesses. See, I'm actually being positive here. And even though you have consumers that feel negative, consumer optimism among small businesses has skyrocketed. period. So which is more important to hiring and to the overall economy? If people have jobs, what they do and what they say are going to be different things.
What they do and what they say are different things, and I think it's a matter of timing, because feelings do translate into action. And if consumers are feeling bearish about this economy, it matters for hiring because it's a consumer-driven economy. Consumers are driving the industries that are surviving and thriving right now. Leisure and hospitality, healthcare, which includes a lot of discretionary procedures as well, like dental work, for example. So, we can't discount the consumer mood and the consumer vibe. At the same time, it's encouraging to see small firms feeling optimistic because small firms are the engine of growth for the economy. So what are they optimistic about? I think they're optimistic about perhaps lower interest rates, lower financing costs, maybe an easier hiring environment vis-a-vis larger firms who have outmanned them in recruitment and talent. And maybe there's a feeling of less regulation going into this new year, new administration, that gives them some tailwind to their spirits, so to speak.
Is there a sense that the negativity in consumer sentiment can persist for a very long time and it not be felt in the broader economy? And I say this because there was data out of Moody's that said that the top 10% of U.S. earners now account for about half of all consumer spending, that actually in the period, in the year ended September 2024, they increased spending while the rest of the earners decreased spending. Can this continue for a while because people at the top are feeling pretty good?
As long as asset prices hold up. So if you are a wealthier consumer, some of your optimism and your spending patterns are based on the fact that assets have been really strong over this time period. So while lower income consumers are feeling inflation in a very visceral way, I mean, I was in Louisiana where the price of eggs were over $10 because of the bird flu. You're going to feel that as a low income consumer. But if asset prices stay strong, you may not feel the same pinch as a high income consumer and can keep that fluidity in that spending. But yes, the fact that this is a lopsided consumption market is a very real thing. If asset prices turn sideways, that changes the dynamic for the economy.
That's a tough anecdote and something this administration or any administration, Biden, Trump, very challenging to do because what's going on with the bird flu. Something else that struck me with the University of Michigan survey was that more than half of consumers expect the unemployment rate to rise over the next year. Do consumers think they might be out of a job?
We're seeing that in the turnover rates. There is some anxiety, perhaps, on the worker side. I mean, everyone's seeing the headlines on the federal government and what's going on there, but we don't really talk about what that could mean for the private sector. And from what I'm hearing anecdotally and what I'm seeing in the ADP data, and we've saw that before the new year and the new administration, is that people and workers are staying put. There's a sense that the economic prospects, the job opportunities aren't as plentiful as they were 2 years ago. It's taking longer to get a job. It's taking longer to find a white-collar job. We've seen business services retract their hiring. New college graduates are taking longer to get a job. And there's a sense that maybe I should stay with the employer I have. Also, with the Great Resignation, a lot of people switched 2 years ago, and they're not ready to move. So that turnover is having an effect on the labor market, and it's leading to the stasis that we're seeing. It's like the quiet before the storm in some sense.
Andrew Honhorst, City, talked about the same thing, this low churn dynamic in the labour market they think is inconsistent with a healthy labour market.
If the market is strong, you should be able to quit your job. And that's why people are watching quits come down to some of the lowest levels since the pandemic. And that's the reason why some people are saying it could portend something less positive.
Focused on jobless claims as well at the moment, aren't we? Every single Thursday at the index level, things are still okay. Beneath the index, just focused on Virginia, Washington, D.C., certain places, are things starting to break.
And people put out reports over the weekend of the proportion of federal workers that work in the D.C. area. It's about 20%. So people are going to be looking at specific counts in specific counties to try to understand how this is trickling into numbers to get a broader sense of how to even frame this in conversation.
The estimate for Thursday morning, by the way, is 221. The previous week was 219. Nela, good to see you. As always, thank you. Nela Richardson there of ADP.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. You can watch the show live on Bloomberg TV weekday mornings from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app.